The envelope was on the table. Serafina didn't need to open it. She already knew what was written inside: her name, the amount her family owed, and the only way out. Gideon Thorne was not known for mercy. He was known for collecting. She folded her hands in her lap, took a slow breath, and made the most dangerous decision of her life. She would not run. She would not beg. She would simply disappear from the inside. And in that moment she understood. Nothing would ever be the same again. Before we continue, leave your suggestion below for the next story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay with us, so you never miss a chapter. The morning Serafina arrived at Thornfield Manor, the spring air carried the smell of rain and something older: stone, wool, and years of silence pressed into walls that had seen too much. She stepped out of the carriage with her chin level and her heart absolutely nowhere near her face. That was the plan, the only plan she had. Her family's solicitor, Mr. Aldwick, cleared his throat behind her for the third time in as many minutes. She didn't turn around. His anxiety was his own problem. The terms were simple, devastatingly simple. Her father's debt, accumulated across 3 foolish seasons of bad investments and worse company, amounted to a sum that would take the Ashbourne family 2 generations to repay. Gideon Thorne purchased that debt 6 weeks ago without a word of warning. Then, instead of demanding repayment, he sent a letter. 1 year in residence at Thornfield. Companion to no one, servant to no one, present, that is all. Serafina read it 4 times before she understood it wasn't a joke. She read it a 5th time before she understood it was worse than a joke. It was a game, and she had no idea what the rules were. The front doors opened before she reached the top step. A butler, tall, severe, the kind of man who decided decades ago that facial expressions were an unnecessary luxury, gestured her inside without a word. The entrance hall was exactly what she expected of a man like Gideon Thorne. High ceilings, cold marble, portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same disapproving eyebrow. The air smelled of beeswax and old roses, and somewhere deep inside the house, a clock ticked with the authority of a judge. She was shown to a sitting room and told, not asked, to wait. So she waited. She sat with her back straight and her hands perfectly still, studying the room the way she studied everything, quietly, completely, without giving herself away. The curtains were heavy burgundy velvet. One of them shifted near the window, stirred by a draught she couldn't locate. She watched it settle. Then she looked away. 20 minutes passed. She suspected this was part of it, the waiting. A small, elegant demonstration of power dressed as routine. He is a busy man. You will learn to adjust. She almost smiled. Almost. When the door finally opened, she didn't stand. She considered it. Propriety suggested she should. But propriety also suggested that a gentleman didn't purchase a woman's debt and summon her to his estate like a piece of overdue furniture. So they were both already operating outside the usual courtesies. Gideon Thorne was taller than she expected. That was the first thing. The second was that he moved through the doorway the way certain men move through every room, as if it had always been waiting for him, and was simply relieved he finally arrived. He stopped when he saw her still seated. Something shifted in his jaw, not quite surprise, not quite irritation, something in between, gone before she could name it. Miss Ashbourne. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed to raise itself to be heard. Your Grace. She held his gaze without blinking. Dark eyes, steady, the kind that were used to people looking away first. She didn't look away. A silence stretched between them, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be deniable. Then he crossed to the chair opposite her and sat down, one ankle resting on the other knee, entirely at ease in a way that managed to be both elegant and faintly insufferable. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he isn't sure he correctly assessed. You read the terms, he said, not a question. Twice, she said. A small mercy, she didn't mention the other 3 times. And you have questions? Several. She tilted her head slightly. Though I suspect you'll answer the ones you want to and leave the rest as a surprise. He didn't smile, but something in the line of his mouth shifted, barely visible, the ghost of a reaction he decided against having. You're not what I expected, he said. Serafina kept her expression perfectly, professionally calm. No one ever is, she said. That's usually their own fault. The clock ticked somewhere deeper in the house. He studied her for one long moment, and she let him. The same way she let the room study her, with complete stillness, no indication of what moved underneath. Then he stood. "Dinner is at 8, he said, as if the last 4 minutes had been a simple exchange about weather. "Mrs. Howell will show you to your rooms." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame just for a second and said without turning, "You owe me nothing. Stay anyway." And then he was gone. Serafina sat very still in the empty room. The curtain near the window shifted again in the draught, then went quiet. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached over slowly and pulled it shut. She told herself it was only because of the cold. She almost believed it. The next morning, Thornfield Manor woke before Serafina did. She heard it through the walls, the careful choreography of a household operating at precise intervals, footsteps in the corridor at 6, doors opening and closing with practiced quietness, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread rising from the floors below, steady as a clock. She lay still for a moment, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The room was well appointed, not warm exactly, but considered, the kind of room that said someone made decisions about it, without particularly caring whether the occupant found it comfortable. The fireplace had been lit before dawn. Someone knew she was cold before she knew it herself. She wasn't sure if that was attentive or unsettling. She decided it was both. Gideon Thorne had not slept particularly well. This was not, he told himself, connected to anything. He had not slept well for years. It had nothing to do with the fact that Serafina Ashbourne sat across from him yesterday and looked at him as though she were the one conducting the interview. He stood at the window of his study while the house stirred around him, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee that went cold without him noticing. Outside, the gardens were pale and wet with morning dew, the rose hedges still tight and unopened, early spring, too soon for anything to bloom. He had been 26 years old the last time he made the mistake of trusting a woman who had nothing to lose. Her name was Helena Mare. The daughter of a baron from the north, arrived in London for her first season, with a smile that suggested she knew exactly how rare she was and intended to price herself accordingly. She was witty and warm and said exactly the things a man wanted to hear, which should have been his first warning. In his experience, people who always said the right thing had usually rehearsed it. He proposed after 4 months. He was not proud of the speed. She accepted with what he believed at the time was joy. What it actually was, he understood later, was relief. 3 weeks before the wedding, he found the letters. Not hidden, not locked away. Simply left in a drawer she didn't think he would open. Correspondence with a man she had been writing to for 2 years. A man she described, in her own hand, as the one she would have chosen freely if freedom had been something women like her were given. Gideon read every letter. He didn't confront her. He cancelled the engagement through his solicitor, the same way one cancels a subscription to a publication one no longer finds useful. He was precise. He was cold. He was so thoroughly composed that the solicitor later told a colleague he had never seen a man appear so unbothered by the destruction of his own future. What the solicitor didn't see was the hour Gideon spent alone in this same study afterward, standing at this same window, watching the garden go dark. He never looked for softness in another person after that. Not because he was bitter, or so he told himself, but because he had simply recalibrated, expectations adjusted, world restored to its correct and manageable order. 7 years was a long time to be correct. The knock at the study door came at precisely 9 o'clock. "Miss Ashbourne, Your Grace," said Mrs. Howell from the other side. "She asks whether you require her presence this morning, or whether she should make her own arrangements." Gideon set down the cold coffee. Make her own arrangements. He turned the phrase over once. Most people in her position would have presented themselves at the door, compliant and careful, hoping to make a good impression. She was asking politely but clearly whether she could simply be left alone. "Tell her she may do as she pleases," he said. A pause. "Very good, sir." He heard Mrs. Howell's footsteps retreat down the corridor. He stood at the window for another moment, looking at the garden. Then, without fully deciding to, he crossed to his desk and opened the ledger where he kept records of the estate's accounts. He found the page with the Ashbourne debt, the full figure, the terms, the date of transfer. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the ledger without writing anything. He told himself he was simply verifying the paperwork. Down the hall in the library she located, without asking anyone for directions, Serafina pulled a book from the shelf, settled into the chair nearest the window, and began to read. She didn't know that the study was 3 doors away. She didn't know that the man inside it stood very still for 6 full minutes after hearing her name. And she certainly didn't know that Gideon Thorne, who hadn't thought about Helena Marr, ta'en over 2 years, thought about her this morning for the first time since Serafina arrived. That was the part that would have unsettled her most. That was also the part he had no intention of examining, for now. 3 days passed before they were in the same room long enough to speak. This was not an accident. Serafina had mapped Thornfield Manor the way she mapped every unfamiliar place, carefully, without drawing attention to the exercise. She knew that Gideon took breakfast alone at 7, that he spent his mornings in the study and his afternoons on the east side of the estate where the stables were, and that he appeared in the main house again around 6, quiet and unhurried, like a tide that arrived on its own schedule and had no interest in being watched. She adjusted her own hours accordingly. Not to avoid him exactly. She told herself it was simply efficient, 2 people occupying a space with minimal friction. An arrangement, nothing more. She almost convinced herself that was all it was. The library became hers by default. No one said so. No one needed to. Mrs. Howell simply stopped redirecting her toward the smaller sitting room at the front of the house after the 2nd morning, and the library's fire was lit each day before Serafina arrived, which meant someone had noticed her preference without her expressing it. She found this deeply inconvenient. It was considerably easier to maintain careful indifference toward a man who was distant and cold than toward one whose household quietly learned what she needed before she asked. On the 3rd afternoon, she was midway through a history of English gardens, chosen entirely because it required no emotional investment whatsoever, when the library door opened. She didn't look up. "Miss Ashbourne." "Your Grace." She turned a page. He had the distinct impression she hadn't finished reading it. Gideon crossed to the cabinet near the far wall where the estate maps were kept, retrieved the one he came for, and turned to leave. He was at the door when he stopped. He wasn't sure why he stopped. Later he would decide it was simply a question that needed answering. "Do you always read 2 books simultaneously?" he asked. She looked up then. On the table beside her chair, half hidden under the history of gardens, was a 2nd book, thinner, older, a collection of poetry that had been sitting untouched on the shelves since his mother left it there years ago. "Only when one of them is honest and the other is useful," she said. He looked at the poetry book, then at her. "Which is which?" "I haven't decided yet," she said. "That's rather the point of reading both." A pause. He should have left. He had the map. He had no reason to remain standing in the doorway of his own library, engaging in what was technically his first real conversation with a woman who, 3 days ago, declined to stand when he entered the room. "My mother chose that collection," he said. It came out with less intended weight than it carried. He heard it land differently than he meant it to. Serafina looked at the poetry book again. Something passed through her expression, not pity, which he would not have tolerated, but something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. The particular stillness of someone who understands loss without needing to announce it. "She had good taste," Serafina said simply. Then she looked back at her garden history and turned another page. Gideon stood in the doorway for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Then he left. That evening at dinner, the first they shared at the same table since her arrival, the silence between them was different. Not the cold, operational silence of 2 strangers navigating an agreement, something with more texture, more weight. The candles on the table between them burned without flickering. The soup was excellent. Serafina ate without apparent concern for the quiet, which Gideon found both admirable and faintly irritating. Most people filled silence. They chased it away with small talk, with questions, with the constant anxious need to confirm they were still present and still approved of. Serafina simply inhabited it, as if silence were a perfectly reasonable place to exist, and she had been living there comfortably for years. He found himself wanting to know why. "So you were not in London last season?" he said eventually. "No." She set down her spoon with perfect composure. "My father's circumstances made the expense impractical, and the season before that." A brief pause, barely a breath. "My mother was ill, I stayed home." He nodded once. He didn't offer condolences. He suspected she would find them intrusive, and he respected that instinct, even if he couldn't entirely explain why. "You managed the household," he said. "Not a question." "There was no one else to manage it." The candlelight moved across her face. She looked back at him without expression, not the blank expression of someone hiding, but the settled expression of someone who had already processed every difficult thing about what she just said and arrived long ago at a kind of peace with it. He thought of the ledger on his desk, the figure, the terms. He thought for just a moment about what it actually costs a person to sit across from the man who owns her family's debt and give absolutely nothing away. "The library is yours for as long as you're here," he said. "You don't need to ask." She looked at him for a moment. "I wasn't asking," she said. Something in his chest shifted, so briefly, so unexpectedly, that he almost missed it entirely. He reached for his wine. He did not examine the feeling. Outside, the spring wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere deep in the house the clock ticked steadily on, measuring the distance between two people sitting at the same table, in the same silence, both of them pretending it felt exactly like nothing at all. It didn't. Neither of them said so. 2 weeks into her residence at Thornfield, Seraphina made an accidental discovery. Gideon Thorne was funny, not in an obvious way, not the kind of funny that announces itself and waits for a reaction, the quiet kind, the kind that lived in the precise word chosen over the expected one, in the half-second pause before a reply that arrived slightly sideways from where you expected it, the kind of funny that required attention to notice at all. She noticed. She told herself it was simply observation. She was a thorough person. She noticed things, it meant nothing. It started on a Tuesday in the East Corridor, when she nearly collided with him coming around a corner. He caught her by the arm, a single automatic gesture, steady and brief, and then released her immediately, as if contact were a thing that required immediate correction. "My apologies," he said. "Mine," she said. They both stepped to the same side, then the other, then back. Gideon looked at her with an expression of profound, dignified suffering. "Perhaps," he said, "one of us should simply stand still." "Alphabetically," she said without hesitation. "Ashbourne precedes Thorne." He stared at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he stepped aside. She walked past him with her chin perfectly level and her mouth doing something she refused to call a smile. Behind her, she thought, she was almost certain, she heard the faintest exhale. Not quite a laugh. The controlled cousin of one. She kept walking. But it was the afternoon of the 14th day that something shifted in a way she couldn't immediately categorize or dismiss. She was in the garden. The real garden, not the manicured front grounds, but the walled section at the back of the estate, slightly wild, where the roses grew without particular instruction, and the gravel paths had long since lost their edges to creeping moss. She found it on her 5th day, and returned to it whenever the library felt too interior, too still. She was sitting on the stone bench near the far wall, a letter from her younger sister Margaret open in her lap, when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn. "I'm not in need of company," she said pleasantly. "Neither am I," said Gideon. "I'm in need of that bench. I come here every Thursday." She looked up then. He stood a few feet away, jacket removed, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, so different from the composed architectural version of himself he presented indoors that for a moment she simply looked without meaning to. "It's Wednesday," she said. He glanced at her. Something unguarded moved through his expression, there and gone like a reflection on water. "So it is," he said quietly. He didn't leave. She moved slightly to one side of the bench without commenting on it. He sat down at the opposite end, leaving a careful, proper distance between them, and looked out at the garden the way a man looks at something that has held him together through more than he intends to explain. The roses along the far wall were beginning to open, pale and unhurried, the first proper blooms of spring. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly sweet underneath it. A bird called twice from somewhere in the old elm, then went quiet. The silence between them settled differently in open air, less formal, less defended. "Your sister writes often," he said, nodding at the letter. "Every week without fail." Seraphina folded it carefully. "She writes the way most people talk, at considerable length on a great number of subjects, with absolute confidence that all of it is fascinating." "Is it?" She considered this seriously. "Mostly. She's 17 and in love with a curate's son who doesn't know she exists, so at least 4 pages are dedicated to that situation from every possible angle." She paused. Last week she included a diagram. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "A diagram," he repeated, labeled with footnotes. Something happened to his face then. A slow, reluctant, entirely genuine thing, the kind of smile a man produces when he has genuinely tried not to and simply run out of resistance. It didn't last long, but it was real. She saw it fully before he composed himself, and she stored it away somewhere she chose not to inspect. Nobody had warned her about that smile. She looked back at the roses. "She sounds remarkable," he said. "She's exhausting," said Serafina. "She's also the best person I know." A quiet settled between them again, this one with more warmth in it than any silence they had shared before, comfortable in a way neither of them had budgeted for. "You protected her," he said. Not a question, not an intrusion, simply an observation from someone who had been paying attention. Her hands stilled slightly on the folded letter. "I tried to," she said. He didn't push further. He simply nodded once, looked back at the garden, and let the moment exist without pulling at it. That was the thing she noticed, the thing nobody had mentioned about Gideon Thorne. He didn't pull, he didn't crowd. He held his ground and let other people keep theirs, and in doing so created a kind of space that was more disarming than any intrusion could have been. She was still thinking about that when he stood to leave 20 minutes later. "The bench is yours on Thursdays," he said. "It was already mine on Wednesdays," she replied. He almost smiled again. She caught the edge of it. "Good night, Miss Ashbourne." "Good night, Your Grace." He walked back toward the house and she watched him go, just for a moment, just the length of one quiet breath. Before turning back to the roses, she wasn't really looking at anymore. The letter from Margaret sat folded in her lap. She didn't reopen it. She sat in the garden until the last of the light went, thinking about a smile she had no business storing anywhere at all. And somewhere in the deepest, most honest part of herself, she began to suspect that disappearing from the inside was considerably harder than she originally planned. She found it on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after her arrival. Not deliberately. She wasn't searching for anything. She was returning a book to the far shelf in the library, the tall one near the window, where the older volumes lived in companionable disorder, when a folded paper slipped from between 2 books and fell to the floor at her feet. She picked it up without thinking. It wasn't sealed, it wasn't addressed. It was a single page, the handwriting dense and controlled, the ink faded to the color of old tea. She read the first line before she understood she was reading anything personal. Then she read the second. Then she stopped. "Gideon, I am writing this because I am a coward and cannot say it to your face. What I did was not about you. I want you to know that, even if knowing it changes nothing. You were good to me. You were more than I deserved, and I think some part of me resented you for it, which tells you everything about the state I was in and nothing about your worth. I do not ask your forgiveness. I only ask that you don't close yourself off entirely. You were not built for solitude, neither of us was." H. Serafina stood very still. The library was quiet around her. Outside the window, the spring morning went about its business, without interest in what had just shifted inside her chest. She folded the letter exactly as she found it. She placed it back between the same 2 books. She pressed it gently into place with one finger and stepped back. Then she stood there for a long moment, looking at the shelf. You were not built for solitude. She thought about the bench on Wednesdays, about the way he held his ground and gave other people theirs, about the study door that stayed closed every morning, about a man who purchased a stranger's debt and asked for nothing except presence, not service, not conversation, not gratitude, just presence. She had assumed it was control, a quiet, elegant form of power, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice because it never needed to. Now she wasn't certain. Now she thought it might be something else entirely, something considerably more difficult to dismiss. She didn't tell him what she found. That evening at dinner she was quieter than usual, which was already saying something. Gideon noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't mention it, which was precisely how he noticed everything. He gave her the silence and didn't push at its edges. She was beginning to understand that this, for him, was a form of care. The thought arrived without permission and refused to leave. After dinner, she returned to the library. She sat in her chair. She did not read. She looked at the window, the curtain still, the glass dark with evening, and tried to reassemble the tidy, manageable version of this arrangement she had carried with her from the beginning. The version where he was simply a creditor, where she was simply fulfilling terms, where none of it needed to mean anything beyond the practical and the temporary. It was a good version. She had believed it thoroughly for nearly a month. She wasn't sure she believed it anymore. 3 days later, she did something she didn't plan to do. She was in the study doorway. She had knocked to return a ledger Mrs. Howell asked her to deliver when she saw it. On the corner of his desk, half beneath a stack of correspondence, the edge of a document with the Ashbourne name printed clearly at the top. Her debt. She didn't move. Gideon looked up from what he was writing. He saw where her eyes had gone. He didn't reach to cover it. He simply set down his pen and waited. "You've reviewed it recently," she said. "I review all active accounts regularly," he said, completely level, entirely neutral. "And?" she said. A pause, the kind with texture. "And nothing," he said. "It remains as agreed." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The room was very quiet, only the scratch of wind at the window and the distant tick of the hallway clock filling the space between them. "You could have sent a solicitor," she said, "to manage the terms. You didn't need me here in person." He said nothing. "There was no practical reason for this arrangement," she said. Her voice was even, measured. She wasn't accusing him. She was simply following the thought to its conclusion the way she followed every thought, all the way to the end, regardless of what she found there. The debt could have been managed at a distance, with paperwork. Gideon picked up his pen. He looked at it briefly, then set it down again. "No," he said quietly, "it couldn't." The word landed between them and sat there, too honest to take back and too incomplete to explain. Serafina felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not anger, but the particular breathlessness of standing at the edge of an understanding that would change the shape of everything once it fully arrived. She didn't ask him to continue. He didn't offer to. She turned and left the study, the ledger still in her hand, her footsteps careful and even in the corridor. Behind her, Gideon sat without moving for a long time. On the desk between his hands, the Ashbourne document sat open. He had reviewed it 4 times this week. He told himself it was habit. He was running out of ways to believe that. The visitor arrived on a Monday, 5 weeks and 3 days after Serafina. She knew this because she had, without fully intending to, begun measuring time in terms of her own arrival, which was the first indication that something in her internal accounting had shifted without her authorization. His name was Lord Ashford. She learned this from Mrs. Howell, who delivered the information with the particular economy of a woman who understood that facts were useful and opinions were expensive. He was an old acquaintance of Gideon's. He came with a letter of introduction from the Duchess of Pemberton, and the kind of easy confidence that suggested he had never once walked into a room and felt unwelcome. Serafina was in the garden when he arrived. She stayed there. She heard them through the study window, which was open for the first time since she came to Thornfield, the spring finally warm enough to permit it. She wasn't listening deliberately. She was sitting on the bench, a book open in her lap, and the voices simply arrived on the air. "I understand you have a guest," Lord Ashford was saying. His voice was pleasant, well-bred, the kind that carried without effort. "A resident," said Gideon, precise, immediate. A small pause. "Forgive me, a resident." The correction was accepted without comment, but she could hear the curiosity underneath it, the particular interest of a man who has just noticed a door that wasn't mentioned in the floor plan. "The Pemberton dinner is the 15th, Lord Ashford continued. "The Duchess specifically requested your attendance. She also, and I relay this with the greatest reluctance, mentioned Lady Cassandra." Silence. "Did she?" said Gideon, flat, not a question. "She is under the impression that the arrangement is still being considered." "The arrangement," said Gideon, "was never more than a suggestion from 2 families with too much time and not enough restraint." "Be that as it may." Lord Ashford's voice carried the gentle persistence of a man delivering an unpleasant message he is being paid to finish. "The Duchess expects an answer by the 15th, a public one." The study went quiet. Serafina looked at her book without reading it. Lady Cassandra. The name settled in the air above the garden and refused to dissipate. She was being very calm about this. She was being sensible and measured and entirely appropriate about this. She turned a page she hadn't read. Lord Ashford stayed for lunch and departed by 2, having apparently concluded his business and found nothing further of interest to detain him. Serafina returned to the library. She sat in her chair and stared at the curtain near the window, still closed, the way she left it weeks ago, and decided very firmly that nothing she had overheard was any of her concern. The arrangement was between Gideon and a family she had never met. She was here for 1 year, under a set of terms after which she would return to her own life and he would return to his. This was correct. This was the agreed shape of things. She believed this entirely and without reservation. She believed it so thoroughly that when Gideon appeared in the library doorway an hour later, she didn't look up from her book for a full 4 seconds, which was, by her own standard, slightly longer than usual. "You were in the garden this morning," he said. "I often am." The window was open. She looked up then. He was watching her with that steady, unreadable expression he wore when he was thinking more than he intended to say. "I wasn't listening," she said. "I know," he said. "You have the particular stillness of someone who heard something and is choosing not to react to it." He paused. "I've noticed you do that." She held his gaze without expression. "Lady Cassandra," she said, because she was Seraphina Ashbourne and she had long ago decided that the truth was less dangerous than the pretense of not knowing it. He didn't flinch. He came into the room and stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, looking at her with the measured composure of a man choosing every word before he released it. "It was discussed," he said, "some time ago. Between our families, nothing was formalized. But the Duchess considers it open. The Duchess considers many things open that are not her business." Seraphina set her book down. She kept her voice even and her hands still. "What will you tell her?" A pause. "That is what I am attempting to determine," he said. She waited. He looked at her. Not the assessing look from their first meeting, not the careful managed observation of the week since. Something more direct than that, something that hadn't been in his eyes before today. "There is a practical solution," he said slowly, as if working it out as he spoke. "If I attend the dinner and make it clear, publicly and without ambiguity, that my situation has changed, the matter with Lady Cassandra ends. No formal refusal required. No insult to either family." Seraphina was quiet for a moment. "And how," she said carefully, "would your situation have changed?" He looked at her steadily. "I have a resident," he said. "The nature of that residency is subject to interpretation by anyone inclined to interpret it." The room was very still. She understood what he was suggesting. The practical architecture of it was clear enough. Arrive at the Pemberton dinner with her, allow the assembled society to draw its own conclusions, and the question of Lady Cassandra would answer itself without a word being spoken directly. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was the kind of solution a man produced when he was very intelligent and not quite ready to admit the real reason he wanted it. She could see the real reason. She was almost certain he could too. "You're asking me," she said, "to attend a dinner where I will be examined by every person in the room and discussed by all of them afterward." "Yes, as a favor to a man who purchased my family's debt." Something in his jaw tightened, just slightly. "You may frame it however you find most useful." She looked at him for a long moment, at the controlled stillness of him, at the thing he was not saying that sat in the room as clearly as anything he had said. Then she stood. She crossed to the window. She reached up and pulled the curtain open, slowly, deliberately, and the late afternoon light came through in one warm, unhurried flood, filling the room with something it had been missing for weeks. She stood in it for a moment with her back to him. "I will need a suitable dress," she said. The silence behind her had a different quality than any silence before it. "That," said Gideon quietly, "can be arranged." She didn't turn around. She didn't want him to see that her hands, held perfectly still at her sides, were not as steady as she was pretending. Behind her she heard him exhale, slow and careful, the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding considerably longer than he realized. Neither of them said anything else. The light stayed. The Pemberton dinner was on a Saturday. It went exactly as Gideon said it would, and nothing like either of them expected. Seraphina wore deep green silk, a dress that arrived Thursday morning in a box with no note, chosen by someone who either had impeccable instinct or had paid very close attention to her coloring over 6 weeks of shared meals. She didn't ask which. She put it on, looked in the mirror for exactly as long as necessary, and decided not to have feelings about any of it. She had feelings about all of it. The Duchess of Pemberton received them in a room full of candlelight and careful observation. Seraphina understood within 4 minutes that every person present had been briefed on who she was, where she came from, and what her presence at Gideon's side was presumably meant to communicate. She smiled pleasantly at all of them. She gave nothing away. Gideon stayed close, not possessively, not performatively, but with the quiet, consistent proximity of a man who had decided where he wanted to be and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Once, when a baron she had never met asked about her family's estate with the particular delicacy of someone probing for weakness, Gideon turned slightly, just slightly, and the baron discovered something else entirely worth discussing. He did it without a word. She noticed. She told herself she was simply cataloguing observations. That was all. Lady Cassandra was there. Serafina saw her across the room, tall, fair, composed with the particular composure of someone who prepared for a difficult evening and arrived anyway. Their eyes met once briefly. Lady Cassandra looked away first. Serafina felt no satisfaction in this. She felt instead something more complicated, a quiet sympathy for a woman who had been waiting on the edges of someone else's decision and deserved considerably better than that. She thought she and Lady Cassandra, under entirely different circumstances, might have understood each other rather well. On the carriage ride back to Thornfield, they were quiet for a long time. The countryside moved past the window in darkness, the occasional light of a farmhouse appearing and disappearing like punctuation in a sentence neither of them was ready to finish. The carriage swayed gently. The leather smell of it and the warmth from the small lamp between them made the space feel closer than the distance between two people who hadn't yet said the thing they were both thinking. "You were remarkable," Gideon said finally. She looked at him. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded expression that still arrived without warning and still cost her more composure than she allowed herself to show. "I was adequate," she said. "You were remarkable," he repeated. Not a correction, a statement of fact delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who thought about it carefully and meant every word. She looked away. Outside, the darkness moved steadily past. "What happens now?" she said. "With the Duchess, with Lady Cassandra?" "It's finished," he said, "as of tonight." She nodded once. "And us?" she said. The word arrived before she could stop it, small and precise and far more honest than she intended. The carriage swayed. The lamp flickered once. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, the voice of a man moving through something unfamiliar and trying very hard not to get it wrong. "I don't know," he said. "I know what I want it to mean. I'm not certain I have the right to want that yet." She turned to look at him then. He wasn't managing his expression, not even slightly. What was there instead, open and undefended and more vulnerable than she had ever seen on his face, stopped something in her chest mid-movement. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She turned back to the window. For the remaining 20 minutes of that carriage ride, neither of them said another word. But the silence had changed again, the way it kept changing between them, settling into something new each time. This version was the most difficult yet, not cold, not comfortable. Taut and honest and full of everything that had been accumulating for weeks, without either of them acknowledging it out loud. When they arrived at Thornfield, she went to her room without looking back. The next morning Gideon was gone. Not permanently. Mrs. Howell explained it with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood that her role was to deliver facts and leave opinions entirely out of it. He had business in London. He expected to be away for 9 days. 9 days. Serafina stood in the entrance hall with this information and did several things simultaneously. She was calm. She was composed. She was completely unsurprised, because men like Gideon Thorne retreated when they needed to think, and she understood that about him and respected it entirely. She also went directly to the library, sat in her chair and stared at the open curtain for a very long time. She thought about, I don't know. She thought about the way he said it, not evasively, not cowardly, but with the particular honesty of someone choosing truth over comfort, even when truth was incomplete. He didn't pretend to certainty he didn't have. He didn't perform an emotion that wasn't ready yet. She thought about Helena's letter. You were not built for solitude. She thought about a man who bought a debt not to collect, but to create proximity to something he didn't yet know how to ask for directly. And somewhere in the long quiet hours of that first day without him, Serafina Ashbourne did something she had not done once since arriving at Thornfield Manor. She stopped disappearing from the inside. She sat with everything she actually felt, all of it, without managing it, without containing it, without the careful architecture of distance she constructed so deliberately over 6 weeks. It was, she discovered, considerably less dangerous than she expected, and considerably more certain. By the 4th day, she knew exactly what she intended to do when he returned. By the 7th, she had decided how, By the 9th morning, she was in the garden before dawn, sitting on the bench, watching the roses hold their color in the pale early light, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has already made the most important decision of her life and is simply allowing the world to catch up. The house behind her was still. The gate at the far end of the garden path opened at 7 minutes past 8. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew his footsteps. She heard the gate. Then the gravel. Then nothing, which meant he had stopped. Serafina kept her eyes on the roses. They were fully open now, every last one of them, the pale petals wide and unhurried in the early morning light. 6 weeks ago they were tight and closed, unwilling to commit to anything. She had watched them open, inch by inch over the course of all these weeks, without ever quite registering what she was watching. She registered it now. "You're back," she said. "8 days," said Gideon from somewhere behind her. "I told Mrs. Howell 9. "She told me 9. "I came back early." She said nothing. He walked across the garden slowly and sat beside her on the bench, not at the careful proper distance of their first shared sitting, not in the measured space of 2 people managing an arrangement. Closer than that. Close enough that the warmth of him reached her before he was fully settled. She looked at her hands in her lap. "London was exactly what I expected," he said. "Loud, crowded, full of people with opinions about things that don't concern them." A pause. "I found it considerably less tolerable than usual." "That happens sometimes," she said carefully. "Places lose their appeal." "It wasn't the place," he said. "The garden was very quiet. A bee moved through the roses along the far wall. The sky above them was the pale, serious blue of early morning, not yet decided on the day." Serafina felt him turn to look at her. She kept her eyes forward for one more moment, one last breath of the careful, managed version of herself she had carried here from the beginning. Then she let it go. She turned to face him. He was watching her with the expression she had catalogued without meaning to over 8 weeks, the one that lived beneath every other expression, the one he produced when he had stopped managing what his face did. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and it was, she thought, the truest version of him that existed. "I spent 9 days," he said slowly, "attempting to construct a reasonable argument for why what I am about to say is inadvisable. And," she said, "I couldn't finish it." Something moved in his eyes, dry, reluctant, entirely honest, which is, I'll note, the first argument I have failed to finish in recent memory. I found it deeply inconvenient. She felt something loosen in her chest, something she had been holding together with considerable effort for a very long time. "Gideon," she said, his name simply, the first time she had used it. It arrived in the air between them and didn't apologize for itself. He went very still. "I stopped disappearing 4 days ago," she said. "I decided I was done with it." "I noticed," he said quietly, "the moment I came through the gate. I know what I want," she said. "I wanted you to know that before you said anything. Whatever you say, I had already decided. Not because of the debt, not because of the terms, not because of Thornfield or the dress or the dinner." She held his gaze without wavering. "Because of a man who came to the library on a Wednesday and said it was Thursday. Because of a smile I had no business storing and stored anyway. Because of someone who held his ground and let me keep mine, and made that feel like the most generous thing anyone had ever done." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, impossibly full, of 8 weeks of mornings and dinners and curtains and benches and letters, and the word us arriving too honest and too fast in a dark carriage on a Saturday night. Gideon reached out and took her hand. Not quickly, not dramatically. The slow, deliberate movement of a man who has thought about this for considerably longer than 9 days and has finally, irrevocably decided. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a single, quiet gesture that said more than most speeches manage in their entirety. "The debt is gone," he said. "It was gone before you arrived. I dissolved it the morning I sent the letter." He paused. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't because I was—" "A coward?" she said. "Cautious," he said. "Those are the same thing," she said. The ghost of that smile arrived, real and reluctant and entirely his. "Yes," he said, "they are." She looked at him, at this man who bought proximity because he didn't yet know how to ask for it, who held open gardens and lit fires before dawn, and came back a day early from London because a house full of silence had somehow become the wrong kind of silence. "You could have simply introduced yourself," she said, "at a dinner like a normal person. I don't attend many dinners. You could have written a letter. I did write a letter. That was a terms document. It was a very poorly disguised invitation, he said. I thought it was rather clear. She laughed. The first real laugh she had produced in Thornfield, uncontrolled and entirely unplanned, and the sound of it moved across the garden and disappeared into the morning air like something that had been waiting a long time to exist. Gideon watched her laugh with an expression of such open, unmanaged wonder that she almost laughed again. There it is, he said softly, almost to himself. She looked at him. There what is? The thing I came back early for. The garden went quiet again. She reached up with her free hand and touched his face, just her fingertips, just once along the line of his jaw, and felt him close his eyes for exactly one breath, like a man receiving something he had long since stopped expecting. When he opened them, everything that had ever been careful or managed or held at a proper distance in his expression was simply gone. He kissed her the way the roses had opened, not quickly, not impatiently, but with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been going to happen and had simply been waiting for both of them to stop pretending otherwise. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was better than that. It was the kind that meant I choose this. I choose you. Not by arrangement, not by duty, not by the weight of anything owed. Just this. Just here. When they separated, the morning had decided on itself, gold and wide and entirely indifferent to the two people sitting on the bench in the walled garden, holding hands in the early light. Serafina rested her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. The roses along the far wall held their color against the sky. After a long while, she turned toward the window on the far side of the garden, the one she could just see from the bench, the heavy curtain she pulled shut on her very first day at Thornfield. It was open. She didn't know when he had opened it. She didn't ask. Some things didn't need explaining. They sat in the garden as the morning grew around them, warm and unhurried, two people who had taken the long way to something simple and found it was worth every careful, complicated step. The debt was gone. The year had no end date anymore. And Serafina Ashbourne, who had arrived at Thornfield Manor with a plan to disappear from the inside, found in the end that she had never felt more entirely, completely present in her life. If this story stayed with you, subscribe now, because the next one is already waiting for you. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.
The letter lay where shadows fall, a name, a debt, a silent call. No tears were shed, no words were said, just quiet storms inside her head. He built his world on stone and steel, where hearts were debts he'd never feel. But something in her steady gaze unraveled all his careful ways. She didn't fight, she didn't flee, she chose a deeper kind of free. We spoke in silence, you and I, no whispered truth, no soft goodbye, but in the quiet something grew, a love that neither of us knew. You tried to own what can't be bound, but lost yourself in what you found. And in the space where words would die, silence became you and I. The garden held what was concealed, a softer truth he never healed. Her quiet steps, her distant grace began to haunt his guarded place. He saw the past in written lines, in faded ink and old designs, but she was not what came before. She was the lock without a door, and slowly, piece by piece, he knew. The silence spoke more truth than words could do. We spoke in silence, you and I. No whispered truth, no soft goodbye. But in the quiet something grew, a love that neither of us knew. You tried to own what can't be bound, but lost yourself in what you found. And in the space where words would die, silence became you and I. I was fading just to survive, learning not to feel alive. But you stood still and let me be, and somehow that awakened me. No chains, no claims, no cruel demand, just open space and offered hand. And in that stillness, soft and true, I found myself and found you. Now we are louder in the quiet, two souls that never had to fight it. No need for words to understand, your heart was always in my hand. No debt remains, no walls to break, just every breath we choose to take. And in the life we didn't plan, silence is where we began. The letter fades, the ink is gone, but what we built still lingers on.